Minded Men, the evolution of mindedness in the West. This is chapter 3 of a 4-part series where we're going to be talking today about evolution of the psyche. Once again, I'd like you to welcome my partner Heiðrún, who's been working with me on this project and is responsible for the lovely graphics that you see here. Welcome, Heiðrún.
Hi, Noah. How you doing today?
I'm doing really well. I'm super excited to be back finishing up this series. It's really made a big impact on people, and I've got a lot of good feedback. People have said that it helps them to understand their own psychology and what's happening in society today, and even to start to plan what they're going to do next. So it's been very useful.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear that. And I recall that you had shared some of that feedback with me. And I think one of the folks who reached out to you had asked if we were going to cover the archetypes at all. And it just so happens that that is very much the focus of this third part. So we are going to get into archetypes in this part of the series. So for that listener who was interested in that, this is for you. So
yeah, it's taking it what we talked about in the first two, and now starting to extrapolate some interesting conclusions. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes. And, part 3 focuses on my personal observations. In part 1, we focused on Georges Dumézil's trifunctional hypothesis. And in part 2, we focused on Plato's theory of the tripartite soul. And in this part, we're going to focus on my personal observations about how all of this ties together and how it relates specifically to the European psyche. So I wanted to start out this particular part with a quote, as I always do. And in this case, it's a quote from the Prose Edda. And it goes like this. A goat called Heiðrún stands up on its hind legs in Valhalla, biting the buds off the branches of that very famous tree, which is called Lereth. From her teats runs the mead with which every day she fills a cauldron, which is so big that all the Einhjarrar can drink their fill from it. Now, the reason I chose this quote is because since this particular part is going to focus on my personal observations, I thought it might be interesting to share a quote about the mythological creature that is my namesake. Now, your listeners might take note that I pronounce the name differently of this magical beast than I pronounce my name. And that's because Heiðrún is the actual Old Norse pronunciation of this name. But when I received my profession as a heathen, the name as it was spoken to me in my mind when I heard it was pronounced Heiðrún. So out of respect for the spirit that gave me that name, that is why I pronounce my name the way that I do. But the Old Norse pronunciation actually is Heiðrún. So anybody out there who's studied a little bit of Old Norse or the Old Germanic languages, you are correct. It is supposed to be Heiðrún. So that's how it appears here. Now, I want to break out this quote a little bit because there's a lot of meaning in this. There's a lot of metaphor and archetype just in what we're seeing here. So the word Heiðrún, or the name Heiðrún, it's from two different words, Heith or Heiðr and Rún. And Heith or Heiðr means brilliant or radiant, and Rún means secret or mystery. So together, this means radiant mystery or brilliant or bright mystery or secret, which I find very interesting, seeing that I'm a priestess. And by the way, I discovered this quote after I made my profession as a heathen. So the name was given to me before I learned about this creature existing. So I find this even more interesting in hindsight. So it's a she-goat, it's a female goat. Because obviously it has udders, it has teats, it produces this mead from those teats. And in Old Norse mythology, mead is a magical beverage. It's a sacred beverage that is served in our rituals, but mythologically, this beverage also had something of an esoteric quality to it. It wasn't merely a material substance. It was the stuff of divine inspiration. And we'll read a lot in the myths about Odin obtaining this mead of inspiration, this mead of poetry. He gets it from Mimir's well and so forth. There's a story about him stealing mead from somebody. So he gets this inspiration or this divine creative power by obtaining this mead and taking it into himself. So that's what mead is in the Old Norse cosmology. Basically, it's more than just a beverage. It's this spiritual substance or this stuff of genius and inspiration. So she fills this cauldron with mead each day so that all the einhyrrar can drink their fill of it. Now, let's break out that word. Einhyrrar means literally army of one in Old Norse, or those who fight alone. Now, if we take a look at who the einhyrrar were in Norse mythology, they were the honored dead who, when they fell in battle, were taken to one of the great halls in Asgard, okay, by the Valkyries. And they either went to Odin's hall of Valhalla, which we're talking about here, and which many of your listeners may be familiar, or they went to Freya's hall, the goddess Freya. Her name of her hall was Sesrumnir. Okay, and these warriors, they feasted and they fought each day and night in these halls in preparation for what was called the Ragnarok, which was the final battle. It would correlate in the Christian mythology as the end times. So all of these einhyrrar would then return to Earth in some form or fashion to participate in this final battle. And to bring this all together and what it means for me personally, this is my personal belief and interpretation, is that I was given this name because I have a gift for teaching those of the first and second function specifically, those who are what I believe are reincarnated members of the Einhyrrar, and giving them what they need to do their work in these days, which many of us believe are the Ragnarok or the Wolf Age or the end times. So I just wanted to sum up that quote for the listeners out there before we get into the first part. Do you have any questions? No, I know that was a lot that I just went over right there.
No, it is interesting how in just a very few words, basically one paragraph, there can be so much meaning in it. And this is why we'll read things, and if we don't understand where the words come from and we don't understand the background, because it's no longer a culture we're familiar with, it's been supplanted by, I would say, not really culture, but a cult that's been imposed upon us. We've forgotten what these things mean. And it's extremely important to have someone like you explain what the words mean so that we actually understand the deeper meaning in these type of things, and we can take out something from it. These aren't just stories. These are ways that our ancestors took their wisdom and made it so that it could endure the ages, and so that there could be a lot of meaning in a very small amount of text. This was done purposely. So it's important that we have the opportunity to learn a little bit about this. It really is the wisdom of our ancestors.
Indeed, indeed. So let's get into a little bit of my background. This part is called Evolution of the Psyche. And, in the first two parts, we talked about the individuals who gave us their respective theories or hypotheses. And again, since this part's going to deal with my personal observations, I thought it might be useful to share a little bit about my background and how I came to do the spiritual work that I do now. So I identify myself as an observer and a reflector of challenges confronting the modern West, what in the old days would have been called a seer, basically. And although I have had what some might call a supernatural or a psychic ability to perceive things, for the most part, it's just a lot of listening and a lot of math, being able to calculate, projections based on the data that I have, and show people where I see things going, whether it's where I see things going on the grand scale, or how I see things going for somebody in their own lives. Based on where they've come from and what they're doing in the present, and what therefore is likely to happen as a consequence of that.
Yes, wisdom allows us to perceive what's coming in the future. And when you have sufficient amount of wisdom, it really does appear to be magic to people, because you're able to see things they can't see. And there are people who are incapable of that. They cannot think in the long term. Their brain doesn't work that way. They're very focused on immediate tasks, and that's their role. Their role is to handle immediate tasks. And other people are more focused. As yesterday I spoke with a man, as he said, that those with eyes that can see, those with eyes that can see and brains that can calculate the far future, we have that responsibility to share that wisdom that ability gives us. And thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Oh, yeah, sure. You mentioned brains that can calculate. My personal suspicion is that those who seem to have what some call psychic ability simply have brains that are able to calculate very, very quickly. They're able to process all the data that they're taking in from the environment or taking in from an individual for whom they are seeing, and calculate that so quickly that they are able to project an outcome that is usually accurate. So it seems like magic, or it seems like some kind of supernatural power. But my suspicion is it's just the brain's capacity to calculate extremely quickly. So in addition to being a seer, I am an ordained minister. I received my ordination in 2005 in Teutonic religion. And I've also been a student of classical philosophy and Western thought pretty much since my teens. I had an interest in both of those things, as well as Indo-European mythology, and in my later years, evolutionary psychology and natural law. I have an interest in law in general, but particularly natural law. And my journey has taken me through many different spiritual practices. I have been a practicing witch in the past, and I've studied different occult philosophies, and ultimately came to the religion of my Germanic ancestors in my 30s. So it's been quite a road.
Yeah, this seems like it's not unusual for those that have that are first function people, is that we don't get a pattern given to us and we just say, okay, I'm going to follow this pattern. We have to go and look outside the pattern in order to really have an understanding of things. We have to look at different ways of explaining the solution, and we're capable of taking those in. And even if they conflict, we can usually look at the higher order at which they actually agree on and synthesize truth out of these various different systems. And I think that's almost confusing to people who are in the third function. They look at that as if it's some sort of a heresy. But I think being able to synthesize truth out of many, many different philosophies and ideas, and picking out what is true from them and synthesizing it together, is one of the defining factors of first function people.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, as we are about to get into the first slide, some of that is going to come into play here, because in addition to being able to see things through the lens of our pagan Indo-European ancestors, whether that's through the Germanic peoples or the Greek peoples, I've also been able to see through the lens of early Christianity, or what was called Gnosticism. And I have found a lot of truth in that. And I think that there is one absolute universal truth, and we just perceive it through the lens of our own personal experience and our own culture that we've been initiated into. And so, yeah, a first function person has the gift typically of being able to sort of navigate through all of those various lenses and find what is the core truth that is there, that is universal. So in this first slide, we're going to talk about the gender in the psyche. So as we've spoken about before, there are masculine and feminine elements to our energy. We've talked about that in a separate video. And we've talked about masculine and feminine a little bit in the functions. We're going to talk about it now in the mind. So once again, we have an image here of our man or our woman with the three different aspects of the soul that we talked about in the last series, Plato's tripartite theory. So at the very bottom there, where the appetitive sits, that is where the body mind is, or the psyche of the body. And this is a feminine mind. It's the seat of desire. It is what drives us to pursue food, water, sex, sleep, all of our primal drives that we need to survive and to reproduce. And to some extent, it also extends to safety and security, what would constitute the second rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for those who've studied a little bit of psychology and are familiar with that. At the seat of the second aspect of the soul, the spirited aspect of the soul, that is a masculine mind. It's the seat of courage. And this is where all of our impetus to act and to act rightly in the world, that's where that comes from. What I've referred to in another video as masculine vigor, which women can also possess and to some degree do possess. It is that impetus to will, to do something, to move out into the world and to act. It's what gives us courage. It's what gives us strength. It's what gives us endurance and stamina and the will to power and all of those sorts of things. It can also be the seat of anger and in specific righteous anger, when we are angered in the cause of good. You know, Plato talked about this. So that's where that mind sits, and it is a masculine expression. When we get up into the higher mind, the cognitive part of the brain, what Plato referred to as the logisticon, or the seat of logos. This is where we see the brain literally, physically, and also in concept here, divided into two hemispheres, one being masculine and one being feminine. Now, in the Old Norse, those who may be familiar with the figure of Odin or Othin, he had two ravens that sat on his shoulders, one on his left shoulder, one on his right shoulder, who were kind of like his counselors. And they were referred to as Hugin and Munin. And Hugin meant mind, and Munin, or I should say thought, and Munin meant memory. And Hugin was the masculine part, and Munin was the feminine part. Well, the same thing is here. In fact, I may add a slide that that shows that. But the left part of the mind is the seat of the Word of God, okay? And the right part of the mind is the seat of the wisdom of God. Now, this is the first time I've brought God as a absolute concept into this series, but it's important here because we're dealing with the Godhead. We're dealing with what is the divine in the living man or the living woman. And the Gnostics, the early Christians, referred to this as Christos Sophia. They did not believe that Christ was a purely masculine concept, that the Christ consciousness was this union of Christos, Logos, and Sophia, wisdom. So the Word of God and the wisdom of God coming together. They saw this as being the perfection of the law in gender. And so when someone is functioning from this high place, they are seen to be acting in the divine mind or in the Christ consciousness. And this is really the pinnacle. This is really where we want to be. Of course, we are going to have thoughts and drives that arise from our lower mind, and they're there to serve us because our bodies do need to survive. And there's value in reproducing, and there's value in acting in the world, and you know, we're in this environment, and there's value in being a part of it and acting in it. But we are to be governed by this divine mind, this mind that is this perfect union or sacred marriage of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. So that sums up that diagram there.
Yeah, I think when we talk about these things, there are people that misunderstand, and they think that they hear masculine and feminine and they think it's a manly and womanly. It doesn't mean that if you're using the two things, that you're somehow some gender neutral person. What it means is it's skill sets. There are skill sets which are generally masculine, and skill sets that are generally feminine. But an individual can begin to master both sets of skills, kind of how Odin mastered both sets of magic, the masculine magic and the feminine magic. It didn't make him effeminate, even though people accused him of that. It simply made him more powerful because he had the ability to to accomplish goals, it required the fusion of those two types of ideas, those two sets of ideas.
Yeah, very well said. And, you'll find this in first function people. Third function people, they tend to be more feminine minded. And again, I want to make clear, as you just made clear, it's not to say that they're womanly. It's that they're concerned with things that are more part of the base material world. They're closer to nature, and nature is feminine in its contrasting relationship to the mind and the spirit.
And this is not an insult.
No,
and
no.
It's not an insult by any means. And it is also important that they fill that role, because that role needs to be filled as well. Not everyone's going to be first function. Otherwise, we wouldn't have first, second, and third function. We just have one function. We're all in it. This trifurcation of society was important. It's important for our function. So if you are in the third function and you find yourself more drawn to those things, this does not mean you're defective. You're just filling the role of a third function person, as you should.
Yeah, well, I think politics has pitted the sexes against one another, and it's pitted the very concept of gender against one another, and we need to move away from that and exercise objectivity. The ancients did not see things that way at all. They saw everything in balance, and that's how we need to see them. So, yeah, just like Plato observed that the largest part of the soul was the appetitive. If you recall from our earlier parts of the series, the diagram, the third function is also the largest part of society. It's just how nature populates any species. It's just how it is. And the smallest part of the soul is the logical, or the logos, and the same holds true for the first function. They always represent the smallest part of the population. There's very, very few of them. It's just how nature does it. So moving on to the next slide, the psyche and mythology. Now, this is when I started to really put together everything that Plato had given us and Dumézil had given us, and then also the mythology that I had studied in my adolescence. I was really drawn to many different European mythologies, but particularly the Norse and the Greek. And what I found interesting is that Norse mythology has given us, I think, the most beautiful and complete illustration and expression of how the physical universe comes into being. It is essentially what the whole of Norse mythology is. It's the story of physics told in this beautiful artistic way. It really is poetry. It's like physics as poetry would be the best way I could describe Norse mythology for anybody who reads it. And then if you take a look at the Greek, it has given us, I think, the most beautiful and complete illustration and expression of human psychology, or the story of the evolution of the human psyche. All the gods and the fates and the furies and all of these things, they're all aspects of the human psyche. So I started to look at this, and I began to see a correlation between the 5 regimes that Plato gave us in the Republic, and the trifunctional system, and how these gods in these Indo-European mythologies came to evolve. Because if you study any Indo-European mythology, there's a common theme. The universe is created, and at the very beginning, we have nature itself. We just have these elements. We have these chaotic forces that are just kind of brooming and forming the world, or the worlds, or so forth. And then the first sentient beings with any kind of power that arise from that are always these giants, right? And in the Norse, they were called Jotuns or Ettins or Thyrses. And in the Greek, we had the Titans. We see this in every Indo-European mythology. And then there's a first generation of gods which are concerned with the earth. They're earth deities. They have a feminine modality. Even if they're male, they're concerned with fertility, virility, harvests, the crops, the cycles, the seasons, that sort of thing. And then they get overtaken or conquered or succeeded by the sky gods. This is like the next generation of gods that appears. And they have a masculine modality, again, even if they are goddesses. We see them being more concerned with the masculine domains, and they express more of this masculine vigor. And then at the end of the story, there's usually some end times prophecy, and there's some new age that begins after a period of great strife or a great battle or something like that. And we have these young gods that appear. And the young gods are always these gods that are focused on civilization. They're gods of music and poetry and light. Light is a big theme, you know, sun gods, that sort of thing. So I saw this pattern and I said, you know what? This all fits together. So I put together this diagram that kind of sums up everything I just shared here. But the other thing that I noticed is that there's an evolution of consciousness as we move up this pyramid. So at this lowest rung, which folks will recall is the non-functioning rung in Plato's regime, it's where you basically have people reduced to just raw material, completely atomized. This is what nature is. Nature is just raw material. It's just potential to be used. It's resources that until they get mixed with labor and human ingenuity, you know, that's all they are. They can't become anything. Then at the next rung, the slave rung, which Plato referred to as the democracy, this is where we have the giants, and they have this animal mind. And even in the Hebrew stories of their giants, they talked about them, you know, being eaters of men. They actually were cannibals and ate men. And in the Old Norse, the word etin, or in Anglo-Saxon, I believe it's eoten, that's what it literally means, is eater. And at this slave state, you know, we talked about this last part, in the last part of the series, is it's consumptive. These people consume and are consumed. So there's something about this level of consciousness that all correlates. And then once we get up into the trifunctions, the three functions, this is where we start to see deities appear. This is where people start to have agency. So there's some correlation here as well. And again,
it's agency, and they get to the point where they are producing more than they're consuming.
Yeah, they're mixing their labor with the natural resources that the environment provides, and they're creating something of value from that. And again, the earth gods, they correspond with the third function, you know, the harvests and fertility and, you know, marriage and family and all of that, building that infrastructure, maintaining that infrastructure. With the sky gods, we see all of these masculine qualities that are associated with the martial caste, courage and strength and valor and will. And, you know, they were associated with thunder and lightning and storms, you know, which is really kind of the masculine energy of the second function. And then at the very top there, with the young gods, and there's an interesting story here I'll tell in a minute. You know, these are the gods of high civilization. These are the offspring of really the culmination of everything that's come before, and they achieve the highest of any of the deities in these mythologies. In the Greek in specific, there's a story about how Athena comes to be. Zeus swallowed her mother, Metis. Metis was a Titaness, and the reason he swallowed Metis is because there was a prophecy that he would be surpassed by his child, and he was a jealous god. Of course, he was one of these older patriarchal gods. He wasn't one of the young gods, you know, of the high civilization. So he was possessed by all of these jealous energies. And he did not want to be surpassed by his offspring. So he swallows Metis whole in an attempt to prevent her from giving birth to his child. But Athena springs from the head of Zeus. I believe it's described as actually like exploding out of his head, or erupting out of the top of his head. And she appears shining, brilliant, fully formed. So she's not even a child. She's born fully mature, and she's in gleaming armor, and she's armed. And something else you'll see with a lot of these young gods is they possess the masculine and the feminine. And Athena is a perfect example of this. She's a goddess, but she possesses masculine traits. And I noticed that in a lot of these mythologies, they will express that in the way the deity appears. So, for example, she's armored from the waist up, and she's got a helmet on her head. But from the waist down, she's dressed as a woman. We always see her, with the dress on. And in the Norse mythology, Freya is depicted in the same way. And it's interesting that both of these goddesses, although they have feminine qualities, they also rule over battle. And in the case of Freya, she's the goddess of love and war, specifically like Eros, and not so much war, but like dealing with the taking of the dead. There's this sort of life and death energy in her, not as much as it is in the goddess Hela, but Freya is a very active goddess. It's like sex and death kind of energy. And with Athena, she rules over excellence in battle, in addition to being a goddess of justice and wisdom and all of these other things. So in these first function deities, or these young gods, we'll see the masculine and feminine embodied in how they appear. And like you mentioned earlier, and I've mentioned earlier, the gift of the first function is being able to wield both of those energies equally in a complementary way. It doesn't mean you're transgendered or anything like that. It means that you've mastered the masculine and the feminine in such a way that you can use them in concert. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like a skill set. It's a set of mental skills that you can work out, that there will be a set that is natural to you if you're a man, a set that's natural to you if you're a woman, but you can learn the other set as well. It's interesting too that these young gods are often associated with gold, and you mentioned with light. It's often with gold as well. So Apollo is also a young god. He's associated with the golden disk of the sun. On the top of the Egyptian pyramids, they would have the top was plated in gold. And there was, even in the Egyptian mythology, I think it was Horus was the youngest of the gods. He was also associated with light and vision, and seeing and wisdom. So this is extremely common, this concept. And when multiple cultures come up with the same set of ideas, then those ideas have a deeper truth to them, and it's worth looking into it.
Yeah. Like I said, in every Indo-European mythology that I've studied, I've seen this pattern. It's the same pattern repeated over and over again in the story, the creation story, and how the gods come into being, and the generations of the gods, all the way back to the giants. So let's go to the next slide. And this is going to be the last topic that we talk about in this particular part: the archetypes of the masculine psyche. Now, I know a lot of people that you've gotten feedback from. They expressed interest in this particular subject, and it just so happens that I had already had this prepared for this part, so that's great. Why are we talking about the archetypes of the masculine psyche only and not the feminine psyche? Well, that's because anything that acts out in the world is masculine. Even if you're a woman, if you're acting out in the world, you're acting out through the masculine. The feminine is part of the inner world, the masculine is part of the outer world. So it's useful for us to talk about the masculine psyche, because this is what we're going to be using to act out in our lives. Now, there's 4 archetypes that I perceived, but I'm also going to talk about a book that utilizes these 4 archetypes. The 4 archetypes are the lover, the warrior, the king, and the magician. Now, some folks out there might be familiar with a book. I think this has actually been promoted in the manosphere, that's called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Rediscovering the Archetypes of the Mature Masculine. Now, I've read this book. When I first saw the title of it, I got excited because I thought, oh, wow, somebody has made the same connection that I have between these four archetypes in the trifunctional system. After I read the book, I realized that that was not the case. Now, this is a good book. The authors' names are Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. If anybody's interested in reading the book, it is a worthy read, but I would let people know that the book focuses more on Jungian archetypes, and it also presents these four archetypes in a mature state, and in an immature state. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with what some of the authors put forth in that. And I'll leave it at that. I don't want to spend the entire presentation critiquing the book. I just want to mention it because it is out there, and it does cover these archetypes in a different way. The way I am going to approach these archetypes in this presentation is how they correlate with the trifunctional system, because that's relevant to our discussion. So the lover archetype corresponds with the appetitive, or the lowest part of the soul, or the third function, because this is concerned again with the base material world, with survival and reproduction, the land, the seasons. This is the archetype that desires. This is the archetype that is productive. He is virile. In the Old Norse, he would have been associated with the god Frey. Okay. The second archetype, the warrior, he's associated with the spirited aspect of the soul. The second function, he is courageous, he is active, he is spirited. In the Old Norse, he would have been associated with the god Thor. Now we get up to the divine mind. The king corresponds with the left hemisphere of the brain, or the masculine part of the divine mind, the word of God. And he is thinking, judging, and concrete. Now, this is the archetype who's concerned with law. And so the Norse deity he would be associated with is Tyr. Finally, the magician corresponds with the right hemisphere, or the feminine aspect of the divine mind. And it is intuiting, creative, and abstract. And this corresponds with the Norse god Odin, who is the shamanic magician god in Norse mythology. So these are the four archetypes that I've observed and how they correspond with the trifunctional system, and in specific, the one that includes the bifurcated first function, because that's what's relevant here, because the divine mind is bifurcated as well.
Excellent. No, I think this is going to be very interesting for people. Now, I'm very curious of the conclusions, what this means for people. And it's often people are attracted to one or the other, and so they end up trying to become one or the other of these archetypes. But it's not necessarily that we should be X, Y, or Z. I think we'll get into that later, that it's perhaps a process of moving up through these ranks.
Well, one way to look at this, Noah, is, just as the gods evolved and there were these different generations of gods, I think we go through this too. Now, whether we go through it in a single lifetime or whether we go through it over many lifetimes, I don't know. That's up for speculation. But I can certainly see how in the life of a man, he could go through all four of these, in his childhood or his maybe early adolescence. I could see the lover archetype applying. And then as he moves into his young adulthood, the warrior archetype. And then in his middle years, the king, whether he's governing over his own family or whether he's governing over other men or other people in general. And then in his elder years, being the magician, the wise old man, who knows everything, So I could see that applying.
Absolutely. This is a very interesting set of conclusions that you've come to, and I'm very curious to hear people's feedback on it. What are some of the takeaways that we can provide for people so that they can, take some action in the real world about this? I would say that one of them is to start to see in their own lives where they fit in and what they've developed so far. Not necessarily with the idea of doing anything in particular with it yet, but trying to figure out where you are. So, for example, we have gender in the psyche. If you are really stuck in the desire, and that's what rules your life, to recognize that and to start to develop more of the courage and more of the higher functions as well, and to try to balance yourself out. Not only will it make you have a happier life, but it's actually going to help you get your desires met, your needs met.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated concept, but I want to try to simplify it as much as I can for people. We all operate within one of these functions, yet we also possess all three functions within ourselves. I know that might be a little difficult for some people to grasp, but it's true. So
It's fractal.
it is fractal, just as all things in nature are fractal. Everything contains within itself the seed. You know what I mean? The seed of the
Mhm.
entire tree exists in every in every living being.
Well,
So,
a good example of that is the saying that kings are men of large appetites.
hmm
And we will see that sometimes it's physical. You have kings like I think it was Henry VIII, that he was a big man and he was a courageous warrior, but he also had a big appetite. And when he got older, he got quite fat. But he also had a big sexual appetite as well. He was a king. He was a man with a big appetite, but he was still pretty effective as a ruler and as a king as well. And in his decision making capacity, he did fairly well in that. So he fit into a certain role, but of course we have those other things as well. And I think that the higher up you are on if your first function, you have to have more mastery of the second and third issues than you would if you're in the third function. The
yes.
higher up you go, the more responsibility you have to have control over those other things.
Yeah, absolutely. It can trip you up for sure. I'm a first function person, and I can tell you that I've had a very challenged life because of those very issues that you mentioned. And other first function people I know, it seems to be a pattern with all of us. We've tended to have more challenged lives, particularly in childhood, than third function or even second function people. And I suspect it has something to do with what is needed to prepare us for our work.
Mhm.
In a lot of Aboriginal tribal societies, those who are born to the shaman caste, they have to go through these terrible trials. And oftentimes they have very difficult childhoods. And it's to prepare them for this work. You have to go through hell in order to be able to master these disciplines. So I think there's something to that. And a lot of people who are third function people, they don't face those kind of challenges, but I also think it's because it's not necessary for the work that they're called to do.
And in fact, it might get in the way of it.
hmm
If you have responsibilities in the moment that you have to take care of, you got to get the crops planted or harvested, or you have to, you're trying to give birth to a baby or something like this. You can't be deep in thought about the philosophical things of the
No.
universe. You can't be focused on knowledge and wisdom when you're trying to push out a baby. You got to do the thing that you're there to do at the moment. And the focus of the third function is to provide the raw resources into something, take the raw resources and turn them into something useful so that society itself can survive. And that's why they are the bulk of society, because that's the bulk of time consuming tasks that need to be done.
Right.
And, if you
Exactly.
have a society of just first function people, you can end up with it becomes interesting to be around that, but it's not a fully functional civilization.
No, I've even been in small groups like that, where it's just a group of first function people, whether they're artists or whatever. And it's always a question of, well, who's going to get stuff done while we're sitting here creating all this beauty and, whatever else. Yeah, you need a large team of third function people to build and maintain the infrastructure of any society. And that is an invaluable resource that every society needs. You need very few captains, very few. You need them to be competent, but yeah, you need very few captains. You need many, many more crew members.
And I think especially for first function, a part of our responsibility is to help the second and third function to have sufficient agency that they don't fall out of the hierarchy down into the slave area, that they don't that the basis of society isn't crumbling. And that's why we're looking into the long-term future for what undermines society. Odin is always looking to put off Ragnarok. How can he, figure out, what can he figure out to put off the destruction of society a little bit? And basically he's looking at how can we avoid the undermining of existence. And so the first function are very often looking to that. How do we share that light, that knowledge, that wisdom with people? And it is interesting that you put music, poetry, and these things in with that. Traditionally or historically, those art was a way of sharing truth. Art wasn't just about pretty things. It was about sharing truth through those things, especially to a generally illiterate population. You had to share that through visual iconography. And today, a lot of that has been co-opted by people who definitely don't work for the light side. And they're often the ones now producing a lot of what they call music. They call it art. It's not. And it actually works quite contrary to what a first function person would have done. And, there's an excellent scripture in the Bible. And I think this concept actually is pretty universal, that you'll know them by their fruit. So you'll know, you'll know the production by what it ends up turning into. And so nowadays, one of the big takeaways we can look at for this is keep seeking light, knowledge, and wisdom. And that includes in your consumption of art. If you're consuming music that degrades you, or television, or even books, then you're not getting the benefit of being part of that hierarchy. You're not getting the light from those in the hierarchy. And the good thing is that we've produced a lot of what is now in the public domain, wonderful books and work and art in Western civilization. And so consume those things. Don't consume the current crop of garbage that's being produced for you.
Yeah, I don't even consider that stuff art. I mean, my test for whether something is art or mere expression is, does it inspire? Does it uplift? If I step inside a beautiful cathedral and I hear men and women singing, singing in a beautiful Western chant style, that takes me somewhere. It's beautiful to look at. It's beautiful to hear. It's beautiful to experience. There are vibrations and frequencies that are being elevated when you're in that space. And that is a divine work, in my opinion. That is the work of the divine mind in men and women that one is experiencing when they're in a space like that. But not to sound crass, but I often say, any infant can smear feces on the wall, and their mother might call it art because they love their child and they think it's cute, but that doesn't inspire. And what a lot of people are doing today is the equivalent of that, in my opinion. It
Absolutely.
It's not art.
There was a Roman architect writing about a specific commission that he had. I think it's actually one of the surviving buildings from the late Roman era. And it's a huge domed building. I can picture it in my head, but I can't remember the name of it. And he said his goal, it's a very small door to walk into it. Mm-hmm. And his idea was, you go through this small door in a cramped corridor, and that makes you feel constricted a bit. And then it opens up into this massive hallway that is about almost exactly the size of what the human eye can see. So nothing's wasted on things you can't see. You don't have to turn your head left and right. You just come out and you see the whole thing. And he says his goal was that when you saw that, your spirit would be uplifted. And it was a place of public meeting to discuss the law and government of the city. And he wanted the people that went in there to be in the right mindset, to start thinking about how to be uplifted and how to build up society when they went in there, rather than just coming in with whatever pre-existing ideas they had. And he was using architecture to adjust people's frame and adjust their thinking. Well, that concept that art and architecture can change how we think was not lost on the evil elites who are attempting to undermine our culture. And that's why you'll see a lot of ugly culture. You see the brutalist styles of architecture. You will see they call it public works of art that are often, literally, as you mentioned, it's basically feces welded together.
Mm-hmm.
And this is specifically there to, instead of uplift us, to crush our soul. And we can counteract that by consuming the beautiful works of art, the beautiful works of music. There are still people producing modern, beautiful music, but you have to be discerning and look for it. And that is, if you're in the third function, you may not be able to produce art, but you still need to be a wise consumer of it. And not think that it doesn't matter, not think that aesthetics don't matter. They are hugely important, even if you're unable to produce them.
Oh yeah, that was part of the quadrivium. It was part of what we used to be educated on.
And we had to educate people on that because it doesn't always come instinctually. We don't always know these things by instinct. And yet once they're explained to you and once you understand them, they become obvious. And this should be back in school again. And if your children aren't learning about these things, in fact, your children are probably learning the opposite, take the time to teach them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to disagree about it not being instinctual. For me, at least, the test as to whether or not something is genuinely art is, how does it make me feel? Because particularly with music, but I think this applies to any of the arts, it could be writing, it could be visual art, dance, whatever. It's supposed to be emotive. It's supposed to evoke an emotion in the consumer. And, you just have to ask yourself, does this make me feel good? Or does it make me feel bad? I mean, there's a lot of music out there. I mean, it makes you want to kill yourself. It's so depressing and soul sucking. Or it's monotonous, it's robotic, and it doesn't inspire. It doesn't make you feel good or take you to a higher place emotionally. That's the test for me. Does it take me somewhere emotionally that's positive?
Yeah, absolutely. That is an interesting aspect to it as well. And when I teach people about agency, I'm always bringing up that they need to avoid, especially music that is lowering their agency. And a lot of modern music, a lot of modern pop culture talks about just giving in and doing whatever you want. And it's incredibly promiscuous. It's incredibly out of control. It's
outright vulgar in some cases.
Sorry?
I said it's outright vulgar in some cases.
Yes, exactly. And it's hyper consumptive because it wants to push you out of the hierarchy and down into the slave area, which is on the way to non-functioning.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a system in place anymore to manage the slaves. And so when you get into that, when you're pushed down into that or allow yourself to fall into it, then you very quickly fall into the non-functioning. And I see very often the parents who embrace their slave status, their children are completely non-functional. I think we're going to see that with all of the people that have heavily embraced the lockdown and the mask wearing and the social isolation. And their children are going to be permanently scarred by this, and they will be into the non-functioning category, unable to do anything because they've not seen what normal life is like. They've basically grown up in a prison of their parents' creation.
I've already seen that, unfortunately. And as you know, I do not wear a mask. And one of the things that I try to make a point of doing when I'm out, running my errands or going to the grocery store, is if I see a child, and oftentimes these children are masked, which to me, that's abuse, but when I see a child, I make a point to smile and make eye contact so that at least they have one other human being that they're making some kind of visual connection with that looks normal, because all they're seeing is masked faces. And, I know we're digressing a little bit from our presentation here, but I think this is important. A child's brain is developing in their very early formative years. And to put a child out into the world where all they're seeing is masked faces and they themselves have to be masked, that is so traumatizing and destructive to that developing brain. I mean, I don't have words for it. So, for those of us who choose to live as free men and women and not submit to this tyranny, I mean, this is something to do. When you're out going about your business, if you see a child, make eye contact and smile, because that might be the only normal face they see in the day.
Yeah, I do the same. I do this to children especially, but to anyone that I see. And I will notice that there's this bifurcation with the individuals that aren't wearing a mask. They walk down the street with their chest out, their chin up, they smile at you, and they're warm and they're like radiating that light, that brightness, that life. And you'll see the people wearing masks, they're a little hunched over, like they're trying to hide and be small. And they've got those eyes like a deer that you've caught in the headlights and you're about to run it over. And it's looking at you like it's staring death in the face. And being that afraid for that long is going to permanently damage their brain. It's going to be very hard for them to overcome that. So I think we are going to see this bifurcation of society. We might be shedding dead weight, so to speak.
Yeah.
And, it's democracies always tend to decay. We're decaying from the slave democracy into the non-functioning. But there are some of us that have decided to go in the other direction. And so we're going to work our way up.
Yeah.
And we're going to gather together and we're going to work together and we're going to cooperate together and we're going to do it in the midst of all of this chaos. Every civilization that ever existed was formed in the midst of chaos. Rome wasn't formed by going around and asking the neighboring cities, hey, would it be okay if we formed a city over here? It's not what they did. They formed the city and then they pushed everyone else out of their way. And then they went and kidnapped wives from the neighbors. They basically, every civilization was ever founded was founded because the individuals that decided to create it used their coordination, their organization, and their force to build something.
Well, that's what the immune system does in the presence of disease, or a white blood cell in the presence of infection, the same thing.
And I really think we're going to do that. And it's hard to imagine now because the bifurcation just started.
Right.
But the individuals that are going down fast. And the individuals that are going up fast. I've never been surrounded by so many physically fit, economically successful men in my life. And it's not just because I'm getting older, because then it wouldn't be physically fit. You'd think that they'd be getting less fit. Mm-hmm. I see men, the men that I'm around, they weren't at this state. They weren't on this trajectory 10 years ago, 5 years ago even.
Something has pushed them to it.
Exactly. They've picked their side. They've decided what they want to be, a non-functioning or a slave side, or in this case, they chose that they want to be in that hierarchy. They want to climb that and find their place in it. So I have a lot of hope. I'm definitely not black belt. I have a lot of hope for the future. And I don't have a hope for the future of humanity or Western civilization itself. I have hope for what we will recreate based on the wisdom of our ancestors and with whoever would like to work at it with us.
Yes, and I agree. I don't think we're going to build something like what we had in the past, because if we did that, then that would mean we haven't learned anything since the last evolution. I would hope that we would take the wisdom of the past and add to that the lessons we've learned since and create something better, something that's an improvement upon that. It's interesting that you brought these topics up here at the end of our presentation, because in part 4, we're going to be talking about the traditions of what I call the shamanic warrior outlaw. And I think a lot of us who've been attracted to your work and my work and our collective work are going to take an interest in that, because that's where a lot of us are finding ourselves having to live in these times. So just to give everybody a little bit of a sneak peek, we're going to be talking about the Mannerbund. We're going to be talking about that system of initiation and ritual and way of life that our elder Germanic ancestors had as part of their culture. We're going to talk a little bit about the female equivalent of that too. There isn't a whole lot of information that's survived about that, but I've been able to dig up a few things that we can cover. And I think that'll be of interest to your listeners.
Thank you very much, Heiðrún. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I hope that as a listener, this has brought you some value. Thank you very much. And if you're watching and you want to know more, make sure you subscribe to this channel and also hit the bell so that you're notified of it. You can also see below a link to my website where you can contact me. And if you would like to speak with Heiðrún, let me know and I will pass your message on to her. Thank you very much, Heiðrún.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's my pleasure. Have a wonderful day.